Do you mind? It's dirt. Can you see it? Hopefully better. Good morning and welcome back to the Petra Pan Apparel YouTube channel. I am Brittany here, and today I want to do a very specific kind of historic deep dive into a very interesting trend that has been emerging amongst my fashion history studies. So I started this YouTube channel, and really in large part the business, because I love making clothes, I love designing clothes, but really what I love is the story of clothes. And I love the stories of women in fashion throughout history, because they're a group of women in the past that were actually very successful and very powerful within their industries, but we don't exactly always recognize that industry as being valid or same as other male-dominated industries. So a really interesting trend that has emerged is that so many of these prominent female designers, mostly in the 20th century and in the late 19th century, were divorced. I've read and listened to a lot of biographies of these designers, and it almost has become this running joke of so many of these designers are divorced at a time when divorces were not actually that common. I'm talking mostly pre-1950, pre-World War II. So I wanted to explore that a little bit today. So first up, I did some research to find some information about actual divorce rates and the history of divorce rates. So I am looking at mostly American designers and American marriage and divorce rates. So I found this chart here, which was put together by the CDC, and it shows, it starts at 1867, that divorce rates were 0.3 for every 1,000 people. Now this sample size of people, of 1,000 people, this includes children, widows, widowers, unmarried people, so it's just a selection of the population in general. So 0.3 divorces would have occurred for every 1,000 people in 1867. Now in the 1800s, from what I have read, most people would just separate and not legally divorce. But this number of 0.3 pretty much doubles every decade until we get to about the 1930s, and then we have this steady increase that happens until the 60s and 70s. Now I will be conjecturing a little bit about why I think this is, especially with my selection of designers today, but it would take a whole lot more research for me to really get to the bottom of why these divorces were happening. Starting in the early 20th century, the early 1900s, there were different divorce laws in every state. And so if you wanted to get a quick and easy divorce, there were a few places you could do it, and one of them was Reno. So in Reno, they had a no-fault divorce law, so you could easily file for a divorce. Basically, they also had a very small time frame that you had to live there to actually become a resident. So basically, women especially would go to Reno and they would stay in these divorce ranches for the allotted amount of time to become a resident, and then they could apply for their divorce. And then this divorce was sometimes and sometimes not recognized in other states, but it was certainly a statement to go to Reno and apply for your divorce. So you hear this referenced in films all the time. So in the film The Women, you actually see them on the train going to their divorce ranch, and you see them at the ranch applying for their divorces. You also hear this mentioned even in the 50s in the film How to Marry a Millionaire. Marilyn Monroe makes this comment.
I know those guys. I married one once. Very, very cute fellow.
I didn't know you were really married. She just got back from Reno. Oh, then you must be loaded.
No, mine was one of those divorces you don't read about. The wife finished second.
But that's against the law, isn't it?
So I also happen to have this book of modern etiquette that was written in, I think, copyright 1935 and 1940. So I reckon this was about 1940. And it does have a few sections on the etiquette surrounding divorce. So I'm going to have a little look through. I haven't read them yet, and we're going to read them together. So first, we will look at conventions relating to divorce on page 93. Chapter 11, the divorcee, gay or otherwise. The dignified divorce. If in a previous generation divorce was frowned upon, there is no reason for smiling upon it today. It almost inevitably leaves unsightly scars, but there are times when it is necessary and the only and the happiest solution. An open hearing in which charges and countercharges, recriminations, and family scandals are freely aired may provide some spicy journalistic tidbits, some interesting reading for the general public, and some fat legal fees. Here she says, if it is silly to speak unkindly about a former fiancé, it is even more absurd to speak disparagingly about a former spouse. After all, if you married a man who was dull, untidy, and boorish, it was nothing to your credit. If it took you 11 years to find out that Jack was your inferior, you can't expect your friends to laud you as a good judge of character. She says, after the divorce, the less said about your matrimonial upset, the better. Okay. She says, for the child's sake, to hear parents criticizing each other is detrimental to the child. Okay, that's very true. The divorcee's special problems is the next section. So here basically she says that any divorced young woman, a man is going to consider her a flirt at heart. So if she's going to live alone, she should probably have a friend or female relative live with her so she can set them straight. Also, she says, a young widow will receive sympathy, but a young divorcee in the average small community is every woman's enemy until she proves herself otherwise. There is a whole chapter on the woman who lives alone in this book. So the divorcee, the woman keeps her wedding ring and her jewelry that the husband gave to her. She doesn't wear it, but she keeps it. If she has an income, she doesn't accept alimony. Designer Elizabeth Hawes even actually has an ensemble called Alimony. If I can find it, I'll put a picture here. Very fitting. However, I think Elizabeth Hawes was the main breadwinner for most of her relationships, so I don't know that she ever would have actually received any alimony. I wonder if she actually would have had to pay alimony for her second marriage. Huh. This is very complicated. So it's saying that divorcees don't have to change their names back, but a lot of them prefer to. So it says you are meant to use a combination of your maiden name and married name. For instance, when Mary Jane Brown marries and later divorces John Green Rich, she is therefore known as Mrs. Brown Rich, or Mrs. M. Brown Rich. She does not have Mrs. Mary Rich engraved on her cards. She should not use her Christian or first name as a part of her social type. It is very odd and very specific. She says if you go back to your maiden name, you can use Miss, but if you keep your married name, you must use Mrs. She has a comment here. Although divorce is now so common, not all families treat it in the casual way of some of our modern. Now we're having a look at the remarriage section. The older bride and the second marriage. Here there is even a diagram of your wedding, what do you call that? Recessional, and where the guests should sit. Talking about older brides and the second marriage. To the bride of 30, or shall we say 28. Okay, here we go. When a widow or divorcee remarries, she takes off her first wedding ring, if she has not done so previously, and saves it with the engagement ring for her children. The woman who marries for the second time will not think of wearing white. In fact, a large wedding is out of the question. She usually has but one attendant, only the families and close friends are invited, and the reception is correspondingly small. Wow. What if your first marriage sucked? Let's see what other tea we got in here. Questions and answers in the back. Q&A section. Okay, when the divorcee weds. I am a divorcee and am about to remarry. May I wear white and a veil? My mother says I shouldn't. May I invite my parents, or should I not have anyone at the wedding? I think we already know the answer to this one. Answer, your mother is right. You should not wear white or a veil for a second marriage. Wear an afternoon dress and hat. Only intimate friends and of course members of the family are invited to a second wedding. Certainly, this includes your parents. Okay. Interesting. So it's an interesting little look at early 40s etiquette surrounding divorce. So it doesn't sound to be thought of as completely radical and foreign, the idea of divorce, but definitely is a lot more of a taboo than what it is now. Now there are a few reasons that I can think of and imagine why the divorce rate among these female designers would be so much higher than the general population? First of all, they are kind of an unusual subset of people because the women working in fashion were actually very successful, very hardworking, very professional businesswomen. Whether they were designers or just working in the industry, they were artists, they were entrepreneurs. However, because they were working in fashion or in the beauty industry, that industry wasn't seen as a real industry, so people didn't really take it seriously. If you're more interested in this, you can have a look at my video about the fashion group in the 1930s. I go into a lot more detail about it there. But basically, a 1935 article in Forbes magazine that basically said that fashion and beauty are not real industries, and the only qualification you really need is just being a woman, because by being a woman, you're gonna understand fashion, you're gonna understand beauty, you're gonna understand how to run a business, which absolutely is not true. So I think that when husbands who may have shared this viewpoint realize that their wives were actually involved in really complex and high-level business and business dealings, this would have caused some tension in the marriage. Some other possible reasons would be things like celebrity and fame, because a lot of American designers after the Great Depression, around the time of World War II, actually were starting to gain recognition based on their own names and their own designs. And of course, we all know in celebrity culture, marriage and relationships tend to work out a little bit differently than they do in everyday life. So the first story I'm going to talk about is actually quite an intense story. So this takes place in 1855, so this is the designer Elizabeth Keckley. Now, she was born a slave, and she was given from family member to family member to work for these various families, and she basically earned the entire income of her families with her dressmaking skills. So eventually she was given to a family friend to work for him, and she writes in her book, Behind the Scenes, 30 Years a Slave, 4 Years in the White House, that he raped her consistently for 4 years, and after 4 years she gave birth to her son. And then after that, she was over time actually able to buy her own freedom with a combination of her earnings and also her clients all pitched in to help her purchase her freedom. So then she moved and actually married another free man, or so she thought, in 1855, but it turned out he had actually lied to her. He wasn't a free man, and he was just completely relying on her for financial support. So 8 years after they married, she left him, but as was common in the 19th century, didn't officially divorce, but they separated. Elizabeth Keckley went on to actually design for Mary Lincoln, President Lincoln's wife. Another designer that I have included who is not American born, but did do a lot of work in America, and who I'm just generally obsessed with. Do you mind? Thank you. Thank you. Elsa Schiaparelli is another famous designer who was divorced. So a lot of this comes from her book Shocking Life. This is her autobiography. So she actually married a theosophist, which was a very popular and artsy and romantic kind of philosophy trend at the time. So she married this lecturer. I think they met and got engaged within 24 hours and moved to New York City, and as you might be able to imagine, that marriage did not work out. He ended up cheating on her several times, once with famous dancer Isadora Duncan, and generally was just a deadbeat kind of guy. So he started just disappearing and didn't officially leave her until much later, but was not even present when her daughter was born. She had to, on her own, go and get herself a hotel room after the baby was born, had to leave the baby in the taxi to go in to be able to get the hotel room because they would not allow a single mother to get a hotel room. Anyway, eventually divorced the guy. And she tells a story in her book that one more time she actually ran into him and was so shocked and kind of traumatized by seeing him. She actually jumped into a convertible with some other random guy and told him to drive off. The next designer I want to talk about is Elizabeth Hawes, who is another obsession of mine. She is an American-born designer. I just finished reading her biography that was written in the late 80s called Radical by Design. Excellent. Highly recommend it. A video about her is coming very soon. And so she is actually married twice. Now, I've read a lot of her writings and did not realize she hardly ever talks about being married herself or any of her own relationships, but she was actually married and divorced twice and had a son. And she had a lot of very strong views about marriage and child rearing, but she, after these marriages, she had a very healthy love life. She spoke very openly about sex and sexual relationships, and even spoke about the sexual spectrum that we kind of talk about today. All the way back in the early 30s, she was talking about this. She was involved in a lot of romantic relationships throughout her life, including a very serious cohabitating interracial relationship in Santa Cruz that lasted for a period of time. But she did maintain positive relationships with her ex-husbands. The next designer in the list is Bonnie Cashin. Now, in 1937, she married a Disney illustrator, and they had a very tumultuous marriage, as described in her biography, that lasted 5 years until she divorced and never accepted another marriage proposal, though she did have one other very significant romantic relationship in her life. Next up is Tina Leaser, who was a very famous kind of resort wear, beachy, exotic fashions kind of designer. She married a marine biologist and moved with him to Honolulu for his work, which actually was incredibly fortunate for her in her career, because that is when she opened up her first kind of beachwear boutique. And they were only married for 5 years, but she did keep the last name as her professional name. Anne Lowe is another designer who I have just recently discovered and have recently purchased her biography. Haven't had a chance to read it yet, but it's called Something to Prove, and I'm very much looking forward to reading it. She was a very prominent, however little known African-American designer in 20th century fashion. She also married and divorced twice. The first marriage she left because her husband had a problem with her having a professional career. The second marriage ended because he left because of problems with her having a professional career, which, surprise, fashion is an actual career. And finally, Hattie Carnegie, one of New York's most famous couturiers. She was actually married and divorced 3 times. She had 2 brief marriages early in life, and the third marriage was a long-term relationship. Now you might be thinking, yes, that's a handful of designers. However, of all the designers I have studied, I have only really come across 2 others, maybe 3, who actually were not divorced. So of that entire list, Claire McCardle and another designer called Claire Potter were not divorced. So of that entire list, 2 out of 9 that I've studied who actually were not divorced. So just simply based on my small yet very prominent sample size, that's an interesting percentage. As a disclaimer, there are a huge number of female designers that I have not researched, that are not included in this list. However, if you know of anyone else that does fit into or does not fit into this designer divorcee category, please let me know in the comments. I would be super interested to research more and find out more. However, this selection does include some of the more prominent and more well-known designers of the 20th and 19th centuries. So, as in many other things that I've discovered from researching these women in fashion, I find their stories to be very empowering, because a lot of them did not conform to the standards of what we think about women in the 19th and 20th centuries. I find this empowering to learn about this history that exists that I didn't really know about. These women who took control of their lives, of their careers, of their relationships, when it wasn't necessarily mainstream to do so. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, I hope you've learned a little something and it has empowered you as well. And whereas something like divorce is not exactly something we idealize, it does say something about how these women were often taking control over their own lives and the dedication they had to their careers and their industry. So I hope you have enjoyed this video, learned a little something, and if you like this sort of historical content, please let me know in the comments as well. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Happy YouTubing, good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are. Thanks for watching.